Welcome to everyone that worships with us on today. If this is your first time or your 101st, we are simply delighted to have you. You are a blessing to us and for us. And we are here because you're here. And together we shall hear a word from the Lord. We thank you so very much, of course, for your continual support, your prayers, your contributions, and your gifts. And again, know that we love you to life. Simply, we love you. And there's nothing you can do to change that. We're attached. So we'll begin our message for today. And it's a very powerful message, a word of encouragement. It's coming from the writings found in Daniel, the 3rd chapter, verses 23 to 29. Very, very powerful writings. And a familiar story. We are familiar with it. We might have been introduced to this story when we were little people attending Sunday school, at least. It's probably the first time we might have been introduced to the story. But it's about 3 men, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And these 3 young men have been taken captive by the Babylonian nation. And they have been made slaves and to serve that nation of people as they saw fit. And so the writing goes as we read from the New Revised Standard Version. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound in the furnace of blazing fire. And then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly, and he said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" And they answered the king, "True, O king." And he replied, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god." And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their head was not singed, their tunics was not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruin. For there is no other God who's able to deliver in this way." That is a powerful, powerful message, a powerful story, an unbelievable miracle. But it was seen by the eyes of the king and his constituents. They actually witnessed this. Here they took these 3 men, they bound them hand and feet, and forced them into the fiery furnace. In the process, of course, I have you know that those who actually handled these 3 men and tossed them into the fire were consumed by the very fire that they tossed them in. Powerful, powerful story. Here we find these men of God. They are convinced and fully persuaded. They believe in their God. They are not going to bow. That's why they ended up in the furnace. The king had erected a new idol, a monument, a golden monument that stood 9 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And the king wanted to dedicate this monument. And he'd asked everybody in his nation to bow when they hear the orchestra and all the musicians and all the instruments at play. When you hear this, bow down to this new idol that has been erected. We shall celebrate. And those who do not bow down will suffer death in a fiery furnace. Of course, everyone obeys the king. When the music plays, everyone bows, as they've been instructed to do, except 3 slaves who were serving the Babylonian nation in the person of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They continue with their day. And there were some Chaldeans who are idolaters, mind you, by culture. They see and they witness these 3 men not participating. So they hurry and tell King Nebuchadnezzar that we have 3 that's not participating. They're ignoring you. They're not taking heed to your decree, to your command. And so the king calls these 3 men and wants to know, why are you not participating? And they declare to him that this is not something they do. They have only one God. And for that God alone will they bow. And that's the God of Israel. Well, this is disturbing to the king. And he has witnesses. So he has to uphold his image. And he has to honor his own decree. But he gives them another chance. And he says to them, well, now, if you bow, in so many words, I'll disregard your disrespecting me. And still, these 3 men who have been named by the Babylonians, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Initially, Shadrach was born and named Hananiah, and that name means God is gracious. And Meshach was born and given the name of Mashal, who is like God, is what that name means. And Abednego was born Azariah, and that means God has helped. So all 3 of these men have godly names initially, but when they were taken captive, they were given new names, and that was to disassociate them with their culture, with their heritage, with their teachings, with their history. They were given Babylonian names. But even with that, they had not separated themselves from the God that they had come to know and they worshiped. So as a result, we find that the king orders them to be thrown into the fire. But in the process, according to the scriptures that I read, they find that these guys are not consumed by the fire. They're thrown into the fire. They remain in the fire. And also a 4th man shows up. And this just really kind of startles the king, that he has to call for backup. Did I not put 3? And now I see 4. And they confirm, you're not losing your mind. This is not an illusion. This is a reality. We see the same thing. And the king is so amazed that he calls them out of the fire. He is so shocked and overwhelmed with disbelief that he calls those 3 men out of the fire that he had ordered to be put into the fire. And out they come. This is an amazing story. And they declare that we will not serve your gods. We will not worship the golden statue that you've set up. They stood firm on that. Even before they were tossed in, they made it perfectly known. They believed that their God would deliver them. And then they added, even if he doesn't deliver us, he can. And the bottom line is that they were not going to bow. The power of persuasion, the power to persuade, is the title of this message. The power to persuade. With this being the election season, I couldn't help but to recognize that all who stand in line and all who mail in their votes have been persuaded. They've been influenced. They've been impacted by the candidate of their choice. They are fully persuaded. Their minds are made up. And they will pull the switch, push the button, do the check off for the one of their choice. There was a power of persuasion in action. Either the candidate of their choice has said something, done something, presented something, they've observed, they've been impressed, they've been impacted. Something has taken place that has persuaded the voters. And such is the case in this story, this biblical story found in Daniel. They are 3 men who know who they are on the inside. They're fully committed to honor and love and obey their God. And they refuse to bow down. So what's the end result with this portion? The end result is that King Nebuchadnezzar becomes converted. And he sets a decree in the land that everyone must worship the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Everyone in the land must do that. And if anyone blasphemes or refuses, he says that he will tear them limb to limb and destroy their homes. And surely if he put them in the fire, he definitely will do what he says he'll do because he's the king. So not only did King Nebuchadnezzar convert and was persuaded through this awesome faith that these 3 men had in their God, but it also caused the nation that he ruled to accept this God. My point is, have we fallen so in love with God and submitted ourselves as Christians, as believers? Have we really given over our being to God? So much so that we refuse to bow down. Or can we be bought? Can we wear a robe and preach to the multitude, to the congregations, and yet we can take a bribe? Can we sing in the choir the songs of Zion, and we can still straddle the fence, be influenced to do wrong, to do evil? Can we truly profess God and live wickedly behind the scenes, plot and scheme to do harm, to cause havoc, to oppress, to steal, to kill, to rob, to take from? Only we can answer those questions. Because God sees us. There's nowhere we can go and not be seen. There are lessons that we can learn from this story. One thing we can learn is that these three men had inherited faith. This inherited faith came through the bloodline of their forefather Abraham. Abraham never wavered in believing God's promises. In fact, his faith grew stronger, and it brought glory to his God. Abraham being 100 years old, for all those years he had been hopeful of becoming a father of nations. He still held on to his faith in God. If God said it, he'll do it. And finally, in his old age, with a wife who had been barren for the years of their marriage, until God's supernatural intervention. And then she conceived and they bore a son, just as God said that he would. Oh, this is just wonderful. This is a wonderful thing to know. The second thing we learn is that the pressure will come. We will have our fiery furnace experiences in life, sooner or later. But the awesome thing that you can be assured is that if God takes you to it, he'll take you through it and he'll bring you out all right. If you believe him, if you trust him, and if you obey, if you are fully persuaded, because there's power to persuade. If you stand firm on your faith and you've declared it, you've made it known to others what God will do, and you believe that he'll do, then when you're up against the test of life, when you're faced with a fiery furnace situation, and then God puts you in it, he's with you when you face it. He's with you when you're in it, and he's with you when he brings you out. Either way is a win-win situation, but are we convincing anybody? Are we persuading anyone to become a Christian? Because it's a wonderful experience. It's a great page to have in your resume. It's just a good choice in life to be Christ-like, to be set apart, to be sanctified. Do you ever really promote Christianity? The other thing that we can learn from this story is the promise in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar made the fire so hot it killed some of his strongest soldiers. Sometimes the fire is intense. It is increased just to test our faith even more. But if God promised us when we were out of the fire, his promises hold true when we're in it. We just have to remind ourselves. You expect a miracle outside the fire. Sometimes the greatest miracle in our lives are when we are in the fire and when God brings us out of the fire. And then we also learn from this story the protection in the fire. According to the promise of Isaiah in 43, God will walk with you in the fire. Whatever the trouble, the trial may be, you will have a tangible sense of his presence. God reveals himself in the fire. We're to watch for deeper revelation and worship experiences during our test in the fire. Because if God lets us go to that point, he'll bring us out. And what a testimony it is when you're going through something and you've got joy. because you're confident that God is with you. That could persuade so many others who do not know God. If you're in the hospital and you're going through something, it would have a great impact on the doctors and the nurses, and even a roommate if necessary, if you were to declare God from your lips and not moan and groan and to stand in fear, but to stand in the fact that God is who he says he is and he does not lie. Oh, there's promotion in the fire. Fire has a tendency to refine, to purify, to cleanse. And after you've gone through this fire experience, and while you're in the fire, you're calling on God, there's no doubt about it. You're not concerning yourself with all the cares of life as you would before being in the intense fire. But the intense fire will get your undivided attention, and you will call and focus more on God. And he'll bring you out, and then you have nothing more to do than to rejoice. Rejoice. And then tell others about the goodness of God. He is good. Our second reading is coming from Acts and is another powerful encounter with God. It's a familiar story that we all have heard. It's coming from Acts, the 16th chapter. And just listen, and we're going to explore that. After they had given them a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them securely. Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. At about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was an earthquake. It was so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's chain was unfastened. And when the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors wide open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, since he supposed that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for lights, and rushing in, he fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. And then he brought them outside and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they answered him, "Believe on the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Have we, yes, you and I, have we made such a declaration? Have such a proclamation? Have we gone through our tests to the point that God has truly elevated us in our faith, and we have the power to persuade, and souls have been won because we have declared God's goodness? I mean, have we really been like unto a Paul or Silas? Have we ever wanted to be? Paul and Silas were thrown in jail because they interrupted the economical flow, because there was a fortune teller making great monies. And Paul just called that spirit out of her, and she was powerless. She had no more gift to use. And the city became furious with Paul and Silas, and they threw them in prison after having beat them as much as possible. They flogged them because they interrupted the flow of the enemy. And the enemy doesn't like that, never has liked it. But the other side to the coin is that God has always intervened on our behalf, and he'll do it for us. He won't just take us in situations where you're in prison, where you're bound, where you can't get loose. But while he was in the midst of that discomfort in the bottom of the prison, where it's dusty, dungy, disgusting, smelly, moldy, creepy crawlers and mice, awful place to want to be. And yet they still prayed and sang hymns. And it was at midnight when most of the inmates were sleeping. But the Bible declares that the inmates heard them praying and singing. And their faith was so powerful, the power to persuade, they persuaded the atmosphere to respond. And the atmosphere caused the earth to shake. And the shaking caused the shackles to come off. And for the doors to the cell to swing open. And God just came through in his supernatural presence, just to let the enemy know that these men belong to me. He did the same thing in the fiery furnace with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. God shows up in his supernatural presence and takes the burn out of the fire, and he cools the furnace, and it causes them no harm, and it makes a magnificent witness of his greatness until he wins the city. They're converted. Paul and Silas, the jailer, was converted, and his family. And certainly he told the story to others who declared they couldn't deny it. Some things you can't deny. They could not deny that the earth had quaked. They couldn't deny that the shackles came off everybody that was in prison. They couldn't deny it. If our faith were to be increased, if we were just to pray and ask God to increase our faith, that we stand firm on the words that we have read. Do we believe God's word? Do we believe the samples and the stories that he's given us? If you do, use your power of persuasion. The power to persuade is within you. Persuade others to come aboard. Christianity is a wonderful assignment. It's a wonderful lifestyle. It gives you peace and joy. And whatever obstacles come our way as a Christian, we know God is with us. It's a win-win. Even when we die, we're present with him. Oh, please consider your relationship with God and consider the benefit of his salvation and declare it in all that you do, so that others can hear of his greatness and desire him. We're to persuade others into the pathway and the walk of Christianity. And if you belong to Christ, you're going to talk like him, walk like him, and sound like him. And that's behind the scenes or on the front stage. You would not bow down. You would not give in. You would not allow yourself to be out of character. You must look like Christ. You should seek the mind of Christ. Do not allow your character and your reputation to be damaged, because God will reward us according to our works. Work the works of a believer and declare the goodness of God. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again real soon. Remember, we love you to life. God bless.